Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Center for Postgraduate Studies as we usually host our weekly workshops. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Asi Pem Kalisa, for those who don't know me, and I would like to officially welcome all of you today. Those who are joining us for the first time, welcome to this research family. And those who have been with us ever since the beginning, we look forward to your robust engagements as always. Just before, starting with today's discussion, which is under the topic literature review, I would like you all to note that I will send an evaluation link via the chats, which is an evaluation link, which is a form that we would like for you to sign. And it is very anonymous, but it assists us in terms of providing more workshops and research support that will contribute to your studies. It is an evaluation for all our workshops, so each and every week we offer a new link for that particular workshop. So please make sure that you do sign the link so that we can be able to assist in your research journey. The other thing to note is that this session is recorded for report purposes, and the recordings are always made available via YouTube on our YouTube channel. Please search the Center for Postgraduate Studies on YouTube, and also it will be sent to all of those that have registered in order to attend today's Zoom for this workshop. Today we are joined by Dr. Kirsten Wilmot, who will be facilitating today's workshop under literature review. Dr. Kirsten is a senior lecturer in the Center for Higher Education, Research, Teaching and Learning, also known as CHETL, at Rhodes University. Her own doctoral study at the University of Sydney looked at the knowledge building strategies used in exemplary PhD dissertations. Doc, we are really blessed to have you today, and we look forward to sipping on your cup of knowledge. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you so much, Asipe. I'm just going to turn my camera on very briefly just to give everyone a wave, and so that you can see who you are going to be spending the afternoon with. And just to say from my side, thank you so much for being here and to join me this afternoon, and hopefully you'll get something useful out of this workshop. I'm going to turn this off now just to help save on bandwidth, but thanks, Asipe, for the introduction. All right, let's get back onto the slideshow. So I'm presuming you can now see the slides. If not, please shout. Okay, so you're here today to learn a little bit about literature reviews. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is informed by quite a lot of literature on writing the literature review, and also drawing on my own PhD, which looked at really good PhD dissertations across South Africa in the humanities and social sciences. So it does have that sort of slant to it, but if you are in a science subject, then I'm sure there will still be some things that you can take away. So I hope you stay with us. And it also draws on my own experience as a doctoral candidate and tips and advice I got along the way. So it's a kind of a combination of all of those things. Okay, so let's just start off at the very beginning. What is a literature review? And I would love it if we can spend just a few minutes, if you can write in the chat, what does a literature review mean to you? What do you think it is? So just in response to that opening question, just jot a few thoughts down in the chat. When I say literature review, what springs to mind? What are you doing? Okay, great, thanks for starting us off, Hayley. An overview of the field of interest, searching and reading. What else? An analysis of the articles you have read, looks at the collection of relevant papers to a specific topic, okay. Reflecting on what scholars in a particular area of studies has done. Great, they're coming in now. locating your work, summarizing the main themes and theories, looking at empirical theory. It's a critical analysis. Okay. It's lots of reading and critique. All right. Hey, Temba. Good to have you here. What else? Anyone else? Okay. Reading, analyzing, and writing down data from previously published sources. Okay. Any final thoughts want to come up? Close reading of texts in the context of your research, existing studies by scholars in your field, reviewing similar research to your topic. It's determining what others have been doing in your field, what already exists. Okay. Okay, it's used to locate your own study. Okay, it provides insight into previous findings. Okay, so it sounds like you all kind of have the general gist of a literature review. So let's now have a look and see what some scholars have been saying about it. So this particular study, these authors came up with the following points about a literature review. It's the place where doctoral writers, so again, sorry, just a disclaimer, sometimes I'll refer to doctoral stuff. Again, if you are an honor student or a master's student in the room, don't worry, it's pretty much a match of a muchness. So just, yeah, you can just ignore PhD and just insert your own degree. It will be applicable. Okay, so let's have a look. They say it's the place where doctoral writers must situate their contribution to knowledge in the wider context of established research. And it's a place where doctoral writers demonstrate an understanding of theoretical perspectives and how these drive research design. They also say it's a place for processes of evaluating previous studies. And finally, how these ground and provide justification for the proposed study. So some of your comments were already pointing to some of these things, but as you can see, there are a few topics here that perhaps didn't come out in the chat, or perhaps you just didn't get a chance to write all of them down. But one thing that stood out for me here is that you're expected to do quite a lot in a literature review, and that's what makes it quite a complex entry point often into a study. So quite often the literature review is one of the first things a scholar will write, because it's a way of writing yourself into the field to find out what's going on. But as we can see from this, there's quite a lot of stuff that you've got to consider when writing the literature review, and we're going to start unpacking this this afternoon. So just to highlight two big sort of points here is that what we could see from the list before is that there's a lot of stuff going on, and therefore a literature review is more than a summary. And what I mean by that is it's more than just showing what's already known, because it's also the place where you need to situate your study by constructing some kind of research gap in your field. So let's just have a look at those two statements in a little bit more detail. So if we look at the first one, a literature review is more than showing what is already known. So what I mean by that is a lot of common sense understandings of literature reviews is basically to show what you have read and to describe the field. And one of the primary ways in which you do that is that you just summarize what other people have found. So what is already known by existing scholars through their research. And that's often the entry point that most scholars arrive at when they start doing their literature review. So if you're sitting in the room now and you're thinking, my gosh, that's all I've been doing, that's fine. It's the way that you start to familiarize yourself with the literature in your field. But my invitation to you today is to start to move beyond this and think beyond this. And to think of it, yes, you've got to summarize some bits, but you need to do more. And the more is that you need to show how your study fits in to what is already known in the field. And you need to show why that's important and why it's needed. So, how does it relate to other studies, and why is that relationship significant? And so what that essentially will start to do in your literature review is that it will start forcing you or allowing you to build a rationale for your study. So that's the invitation today, is to think of the literature review as a place where you are building a rationale for your study. Because what that does is it immediately takes it away from a sort of passive framing of, I'm just going to provide an account of what's being done, to a more active framing where you are actually doing something with the literature in order to advance an idea. And that idea is obviously your research. So how do we do this? Well, as I said, it's a more active process. So you're going to be purposefully, actively, and authoritatively drawing on literature to convince your reader that there is a gap in the field. Because remember, a lot of academic writing is all about argument, and it's about making claims, and it's about convincing your reader to believe what you believe. That is one of the key aspects of academic writing. We've got to convince readers that this is meaningful, that it's necessary, and that we've thought this through. Okay. So another really important point there is that research gaps don't just exist. It's not that there's just a very obvious gap in a field. So if you are looking at what's a study? Student attendance in lectures. So if you're looking at that topic, perhaps for your research, there's not just like an empty, vast hole in the field that everybody knows about. Rather, you've got to create them through your writing and convince your reader. So it's through the way that you construct an argument that you are going to create that little gap that your study is going to fit in. And the way that you do that is by clarifying or explaining to your reader what is already known in the field. So that's where some of the summarizing would come in, but also start to talk to them, explain to your reader what is unknown in your field. And then you need to be saying to your reader, this is the reason why this knowledge is missing. And even more importantly, it's really important that we have knowledge on that particular aspect or topic. So that's kind of the process that's going to be happening in the literature review. And what I have found useful is to try and keep the thesis in mind in very broad terms. Academic writing is very generative, and you will write bits and rewrite them, and you might move bits around. But I find it quite useful to have that sort of overall structure of what you're working towards, because it helps just keep the logic between chapters quite clear in your mind. And I say that because you need to understand where this is going in order to create a really nice, succinct argument in the literature review chapter. So by the end of your literature review, your reader should understand three things. They should understand the nature of the field. So what kind of studies are there? What have people been finding? What are the major debates? What's the kind of data? What is that telling us about this topic area? But then we also need to know, what is it that the field needs more of, and why? Because we all know in any research field, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of studies going on. So why do we need more? Why do we need your study? what's important about what you are offering. And that's what you need to be bringing across. So what is it that the field needs, and why do we need it? And then to start to craft an argument about what it is that's needed to meet those needs or to plug that research gap. And that is how you start to position your study in relation to the body of research that already exists. So it's quite a daunting thing to be coming in to this huge body of research, and now you offering a tiny slice of the pie to offer as a master's project or a PhD project, which would be a slightly bigger slice of the pie. But it's a daunting prospect knowing that there's so much out there. So you need to explain to your reader, actually, there's a gap here, and my research is going to fill that gap, and that's important, and you need to listen up. So then if we think about this a little bit further in terms of the thesis, then you start to get the logic coming in. So how does one chapter lead to the other chapter, leading to the other chapter? So if we can get those three, the A, B, and C there, if we can start to get that coming through in the literature review, it then leaves a nice opening to the rest of your study, because now you've told your reader what is needed, and now you're going to be telling them, this is how I'm going to do it. So quite often it would be followed by a theoretical framework chapter. In the more social sciences kind of writing, it might look different and might play out different in different dissertations or theses. But generally by the end of the literature review, that is the point where you're now going to be going into your study to say, right, this is what I'm doing. These are the theoretical lenses I'm using. This is the methodology I'm using, the research design. But what's also important to keep in mind is that your literature review needs to be in sort of conversation with your conclusion or your contribution, which typically comes near the end of the thesis. Because what you set up as the problem, what you create as the gap in the literature review is ultimately what you are contributing. I hope that's clear to you. So what you are arguing at the very beginning as being really important and more research needs to be done this, and you place in your study as being able to do that research, by the end of the thesis, you need to be looking back and saying, this is what I've done. So it's quite nice to sort of keep that more macro view of the thesis in mind, because it just helps create a little bit more coherence as you go along. Okay, so essentially what I'm inviting you to do today is to move from an idea of knowledge telling, where in the literature review, you will typically include a lot of direct quotes from your sources. You include heaps and heaps and heaps of citations, because you really want to show your reader everything you've read, because I know it's very appealing to want to show your reader, look how much work I've done. I've spent months and months and months reading. And it's not actually what's needed in that literature review. And we're going to be unpacking this as we go. But again, just to emphasize that if you feel like you are doing this, that's okay. It's the starting point where everybody starts this journey from. And it's often a very good way to start familiarizing yourself with the literature, to do these sort of more summaries. But as I said earlier, we need to do a little bit more. And that more is we need to start moving to an idea of knowledge transformation. And by that, I mean, we need to be doing something more with those documents, with those sources, with those references. So it's not necessarily just about summarizing them anymore, but it's actually using them for a purpose. And that purpose is constructing that gap and promoting an argument. Okay, so this has all been a bit theoretical so far, but bear with me and hopefully we'll get to the more practical stuff soon. Okay, so I mean, it's all very well hearing about this, and I'm sure some of you in the room are thinking, yeah, okay, maybe it makes sense, but I still don't really know how to go away from this workshop and actually do this in my writing. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about finding your voice. And I'm sure many of you would have had a supervisor along the way saying, I can't hear your voice in this writing. And the concept of voice in academic writing is a very complicated concept. It's very frustrating as a writer. I remember being really frustrated because I just didn't quite understand what was meant by you need to cultivate your voice. And it took a while. So when people say voice, it's often thought of as being critical. Okay, so often a first step for moving beyond summarizing is to just become critical. And critical is another word that gets thrown around with academic writing without enough explanation, I think, I would argue. And what often happens is the word critical is then often mistaken to mean critique. And by that, I mean to find out what is wrong. And again, as a scholar that's just started their project, that can be quite a daunting task when you are looking in the field and you're seeing all these big names, to think now that you've suddenly got to find something wrong with every study that you read. And I would argue that that's a quite short-sighted way of thinking about it. And Sue McKenna, as many of you I'm sure know and have seen through the CPGS events, it talks about a healthy skepticism versus a cynicism. So critique is more, I would encourage you to think of it as more asking questions, not trusting something at face value, but interrogating it and saying, why is it like that? And have you thought about that? And why did you do it in that particular way? And did you consider these other variables? Versus just being really negative and critical and just saying, this is wrong and that's worthless. It's more about approaching studies that exist already with a healthy bout of skepticism. So that's really what we're going to try and think of. And another way to help develop this critical voice is to think of yourself as joining and curating, so like facilitating a conversation, but for a particular purpose. Because if you just provide a summary of what others have done, your reader is just going to be thinking to themselves, but what does this have to do with the study on hand? So if you can think of it as a conversation and that you are playing a particular role in that conversation, then it just helps sort of switch your mindset away from that passive sort of storyteller, summarizer, into being a more active participant. Okay, so I want you to imagine now, wherever you might be joining from, I want you to imagine that you are a talk show host or a dinner party host. So you can pick whichever one resonates the most with you. Or you could think of it as you having like a birthday party and you've got different friends coming from different friendship circles. And you're at the center of that situation. So you need to imagine that you are the host. So you've got all these people around you, you are the common element to the situation. And your job is to direct that conversation between guests and around the talking points. And the guests are going to be the literature. So it's going to be other authors that you've been reading. And the talking points are going to be the assumptions or the claims that other people are making in their studies. Okay. So part of that role of host is that you've got to look for connections between ideas and authors. Because you can imagine if you've got a group of people, you can't be having this one-way conversation all the time. You've got to say, oh, this person works in the research office at Rhodes and this person works in HR. So maybe, you would have some commonalities or whatever. but you've got to look for those ideas, and that's a very active process. And then you need to go to a step further, and you need to start facilitating or curating a conversation between your guests, but with a very clear endpoint in mind. So you need to steer that conversation in a particular way in order to establish your gap, so your research gap, to a point where your reader is convinced that there is a gap. So you've got to bring these different elements into conversation in a way that shows what is known and what is missing, so that you can convince your reader that there actually is something missing and that it is worthwhile. And the point behind that sort of more argumentative style of writing is that in academic writing, all assumptions and claims are always open to doubt. They can always be picked apart by other scholars. You can always disagree. You can challenge. That is the nature of academia. And so you need to be bringing those different authors into conversation as much as you need to settle all of those assumptions. And what I mean by that is you just need to convince your reader that you have a good grip on the field, you've linked ideas between people, you've told your reader what is already known, what already exists around the topic, and you have shown them that there is a gap. So it's all about convincing that reader. But of course, we've all been there. Social stuff can get awkward. Okay, so let's look at three main things when those interactions can go wrong. So if we take the dinner party analogy here, you can have a really dull dinner party, okay? And that would happen when the researcher gets her guests to speak one after the other. So you can imagine sitting around a table and you say, okay, person A, you speak. Okay, stop. Person B, you speak. Okay, stop. Person C, you speak. It's going to be really boring. And that's often what happens when you just summarize. This person said this other person said that. Then there was another group of authors that wrote about this. And then somebody else did that 10 years later. It's just like a monotonous sort of he said, she said type situation. And that's a bit dull for your reader. But you can also have an awkward dinner party. And that's when the researcher holds the floor too much and ridicules all the guests and prevents them from talking back or talking to each other. Okay, I'm sure we've all been in a situation like this as well. But what you don't want to be doing in your literature review is being too dominant and just ridiculing. And that's where it comes back to that idea of skepticism versus cynicism. You don't want to be shutting down other authors. It's fine to critique, it's fine to challenge, but there's a way of doing that doesn't just put other studies down, because that would end up in a bit of an awkward situation. And then a very common situation that often unfolds, particularly in the early writing, is when the host is just invisible. So the researcher gets others to speak, but doesn't actually join the conversation, him or herself. So that's when you just let the literature sort of crowd your writing. And that's often when those comments will come up from your supervisor saying, where's the argument in this? And I can't see your voice in this. And I don't see how this is, how does this connect back to your study? That's when you are becoming invisible. So I just want to show you some examples, because I think it's one thing to hear this in theory, but it's another thing to actually see it. So I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read through this example.
Hi, Dr. Kirsten.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for you to read.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. If I'm being a bit fast with the reading time, I will make these slides available so you can come back and look at it. But this is a classic example of a situation where the writing has become so crowded with literature that it's sort of losing its punch a bit. So you can see I've highlighted in blue all the different sources that are being referred to in this. And what's happening here is that the student is dealing with some really complex theory, but just seems to be drowning in the details. And because of that, she's kind of standing outside of the text. There's no sort of presence of the research in here, and it's a bit of a he said, she said pattern. And I certainly don't get a sense of the writer's stance in terms of all of these ideas here. And as people are picking up in the comments, Nati, exactly at the end of the reading, I'm asking myself, then what? So there's also no sort of evaluative comment being put in here from the author's perspective. It's more just like a really complicated, slightly confused summary of other ideas. And what that can signify often is that the reader doesn't yet, the writer doesn't yet have a really good grasp on these ideas. So this is often the way we start writing, as we sort of reading ourselves into the field and writing ourselves into the field. But as a reader, we kind of have no idea how these ideas are informing the study, and also whether there's any sort of hierarchy in these ideas. Do some authors have more currency? Does she align herself more to some than with others? We're not getting a very clear sense here of what's going on in terms of the study on hand. So that's slightly different. I'm going to show you another one now. So again, if we can just take a minute or two to read this, and then we'll go through this one. Okay, I'm going to move. As I said, you can always come back to it. So in this example, and let me know in the chat if you would agree or disagree, the student seems to be a little bit more on top of the ideas. There's sort of a suggestion that there's a little bit more control here than the last one, where the student just seemed to be drowning a bit. But it's still a bit of a he said, she said kind of a pattern emerging. And there are lots of neutral verbs here that, yeah, it's still in the category of a dull dinner party, I would think. Lots of neutral verbs, points out, is of the view, suggests, and there's not much connection being made between ideas. It's just kind of this person, then this person, then this person. So it's still reading a bit more like a summary or a list of ideas that are just kind of being piled up one on top of the other. And again, not much evaluation going on here, not much critique. And we also, the reader's not getting a very clear sense of the relationship to these ideas and what they actually mean for the study. But as Sive is saying, there is sort of more of an understanding. There's like more of that control coming through in terms of that literature. Okay, so just then in summary, okay, so we can call this the more invisible scholar. So the scholar, the author is still missing here. We're not getting a sense of how this all fits into a bigger picture. So just to sort of summarize these two examples, the candidates are not actively using the literature to locate their studies, and they're not really advancing an argument and creating a justification for their own work. It's quite passive at that stage. And it's very characteristic of scholars who lack a bit of confidence and authority and are also overwhelmed by the work of others. And as I just want to keep repeating this, if you feel like this, it's normal. This is how everyone normally feels at the beginning of a study. It can be very overwhelming. And yeah, just a question to think about. I have been asking this as we've gone, but do you think that you are an overcrowder or perhaps an invisible scholar? And maybe now you have a little bit more understanding about what it might be that your supervisor's pointing out to you in feedback when they're saying, I can't see your voice, or what's the argument? And hopefully now you're starting to get a sense of what the sort of differences were. So if we go to Kamler and Thompson, and that's where, oh, sorry, let me give you one more example. All right, I'm going to give you a few minutes to read this one. Okay, I'm going to push along. So this one, I would argue, is a little bit more in control than the other two. There is also no perfect piece of writing, but I would argue this one has a slightly more controlled sort of take on the literature, and that the author's presence is coming through a bit more, and that you can sort of see this being pushed into a particular direction rather than just a summary. And it does include a few evaluative aspects. So I would argue that this is an example of being slightly more in control, in charge of the literature. And But obviously, just to point out as well, taking tiny little paragraphs from a literature review chapter is a little bit unfair on authors, I think, because we're trying to show best practice here, and you're taking something so out of context. So just keep that in mind. But it does help just to see things, see examples. So I hope that's just been a little bit useful in just seeing slight differences in between different kinds of writing styles. Okay, so if we move then to Kamler and Thompson, and those first two examples were taken from their paper, which I've included in the reference list, and it's a really wonderful chapter actually to look at in your own time. So they say, when you are developing a critical voice, it's not just about praising and demolishing the work of others. It also involves making judgments and decisions about what you're going to select to engage with, what you're going to engage with a lot and in a lot of detail, and which pieces of literature you're going to leave aside or briefly refer to. But that's quite an important decision-making process when it comes to the literature review, and it shows your reader what is of value and particular significance to the study on hand. Because remember, you can't include everything that you read, unfortunately. So this means that you're going to pay more attention to some things than others. You're going to be looking at the assumptions being made in existing studies. You're going to be looking at what theoretical lenses have been used. You're going to be looking at ideas of epistemology and methodology. How have those studies been done? How has that research been conceptualized? What counts as valid research? You're going to be looking at methods. So the who, the what, the where, the how, and of course the findings. So the findings are often the thing that people focus on the most, but you can get a sense here that there are more things to be looking at. And also just an important point, and that comes back to that idea of being skeptical but not cynical, is to be respectful. There's nothing worse than reading academic writing where people are just scathing about authors. Yes, you can challenge. Yes, you can be critical, but to be just downright scathing, it doesn't set a good tone. So to look at what studies have done, even if you are doing something totally different and you don't think it's valid, my supervisor always said to me, the nicest thing you can say, if there's nothing nice to say, is that the study has raised our awareness of the topic. Just find something fairly positive, rather than just going on the attack with other authors in the field. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. I've thrown quite a lot of ideas at you so far, but I want to now move into more sort of practical applications for the rest of the workshop. And when thinking about how you could go about cultivating this critical voice, we've heard that it's a difficult thing to do. We've heard that it's not about just being nasty about other people. We've learned that it needs to take into account different aspects of the literature. So how do we do this in practical terms? How do you walk away from this workshop and kind of know where to go from here? And I'm going to introduce one strategy that I have found really useful in order to make that shift from summarizing, passive summarizer, to active, what would it be? An active participant in your own literature review. And I am going to encourage you to start asking your literature some questions. That might sound bizarre, but I'm going to make it clearer for you. If you start asking questions of your literature, this will help you to develop your ability to critically evaluate the literature and to create links between studies, either that they're similar or that they're very different. And it's going to help you identify the limitations. And that is going to enable you to start building that gap, to start constructing that gap for your reader and convincing your reader that that is worth pursuing and that you have a study that's, worth having in the field. Okay. So when it comes to questions, there are different key questions that you can ask your literature. The first and the obvious one are, what are the findings? So when you're reading different studies from your field, when you're going through journal articles or new issues that have come out, the very obvious place to start is, what did the paper actually have to say? What were the findings? What were the main arguments? What did they conclude? And perhaps, what are the implications of those conclusions? So that's often where people start, and it's often where people end. And that often results in just summarizing. So what I would like you to think of is asking more questions. So when you read a paper and when you keep a reading journal, and if you haven't heard about a reading journal before, you should definitely look that up. Sue McKenna has a video on her Enhancing Postgraduate Environments website, EPE website. And there's a lovely little short video on reading journals. So if you haven't done that, I highly recommend you have a look and see. So when you're reading it, you'll be jotting down what are the key arguments and the conclusions, but also start to take note of what methods and what data are being used. Are the studies, are they quantitative? If so, how big? Are they longitudinal? Are they a snapshot? Whatever. Anything interesting about that? Do they look at documents? Is it a desktop analysis? What does that mean for the results or the implications of that research? If it's qualitative, what kind? Did they use interviews? Did they use focus groups? Who did they interview? What context did they look at? So start to think about the research design and the methodologies, and start to think about what implications those choices have had for that study and for the field. Is the topic area bombarded by quantitative studies? That's significant, because that's going to be offering you a particular perspective. Is your field dominated by qualitative studies? What does that tell you? How does your study fit in? Another set of questions you can be asking is the fields and the theories. So what field are you working in? Is it across fields? Is it transdisciplinary? What does that mean? My own PhD happened to land in the sociology of education, but I also had to cross over to linguistics, because that's where a lot of the research was coming out of. And that had particular implications for my study and in terms of the gap I was creating. Also be looking at what kind of theories are people using. Do they use theories? What are the implications of that? What does a social realist lens offer on a topic? What would a African feminist perspective offer on a topic? What can they see that other approaches or other theoretical lenses can't see? So it's asking those sorts of questions. You can also ask about the kind of study itself. Is it an academic study? If so, is it an empirical one? Is it a more conceptual one? Is it a systematic review? Is it a meta-study? Is it a commentary? What does that mean for the knowledge being generated? And perhaps some of you are using non-academic, sort of non-peer-reviewed sources. What are the implications of that? And then you can also be looking at what kinds of questions are being asked. So what are the goals of studies? What are the research questions? Because again, that will give you a better sense of the field that you're entering into in terms of what does the field deem worthy of research? What questions are valid in that space? How do your questions relate? How do they differ? And then most crucially, and I've been alluding to this as I've been going through each of these, what does it mean for your study? Always to come back to this point. What are the implications for you? Because that is how you're going to drive that and navigate that argument in the literature review. So start thinking about, what is it that's good about the study? And what advantages are there to its theory? Like, what does that theoretical lens allow it to do? Or what does that method allow us to see? And that type of data, it must do something. It's in the domain, in your field, in the public domain. It must contribute something. So what is it? But then also ask yourself, what is missing? Or what is it not quite able to do? And why? Is it because it's used a very particular set of theoretical lenses that's missing out on the lived experiences of some people in the sample? Are they blind spots, sort of theoretical blind spots? Is the method being used favoring one perspective and leaving another perspective in the dark, or perhaps even downplaying another perspective? Perhaps there are heaps and heaps and heaps of quantitative studies that show us big trends and big data and longitudinal things, but now what's needed is a more close-up, focused, qualitative account of whatever happened, or the learning experience, or whatever it is. Perhaps a different perspective is needed in terms of the kind of data that's collected and the way it gets analyzed. So this is really a key part of thinking about how you relate and how your study relates to the literature. Because if you are asking these questions, I can guarantee you are no longer writing a summary. Because in talking back to these questions, you are starting to review the literature. You are picking apart the literature, not just the findings of the literature. And it's quite a subtle thing, but it's an important distinction. We need to move beyond only considering the findings. The findings of existing studies is obviously very important, but we need to be doing a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to show you one example, and it's from, I will be quite upfront, it's from my own writing. So you may disagree with this, but I'm going to show you it as one technique for doing this kind of questioning work. And I'm going to say very upfront that it's a very explicit way of dealing with literature that might not sit well with everyone here, depending on what discipline you've come from. So if you are working, for example, in the humanities and the more sort of literature side of things, perhaps this is not going to work for you as is. You might have to do this in a slightly more subtle way. But sometimes I find it helps to work with a very obvious example, and then you can kind of work your way back from that. Because of course, each discipline is going to have slightly different sort of weird ways of doing academic writing. And I'm sure you're starting to get very familiar with that at a postgrad level. But take it as a starting point, take what you can from it, and you can think about how it might fit in to your own study and your own writing. So here is their example. And again, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to read this because it is quite long. And I apologize for that, but again, it's hard to sort of take a snapshot. So you read and then we'll go through it. Okay, can I move on or do you need some more time?
You can move on, Kirsten.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so let's just go through this in a little bit of detail so I can show you how those questions came out if they aren't exactly clear. So what I've done here is I've highlighted according to that questioning model that, that I introduced to you. And this is how I was taught by my supervisor. And I found it a really useful sort of model or tool to hang on to when I found it really hard to get out of summarizing. So one thing to start with, just to point out to you, is that it's possible to actually characterize a body of literature in one go. And that's what I've done there, and that's what's highlighted in yellow, but it's essentially that first little paragraph is where, so this is from my literature review, there were different sections to it. This was the experiences of doctoral writing. So it was any literature that spoke about how students experience writing. There was another section on how supervisors experience writing, how supervisors teach writing. So this was just one little section, and it obviously went, this is just an excerpt from it. But what I did at the beginning there is that I characterized the studies as a body of literature. And I described it in more general terms to show the reader that I know that this body of literature exists, and I know that it's typically made up of particular kinds of studies. And in this case, they are small scale, qualitative, lots of interview and survey data. They have a particular kind of theoretical framing, and they view literacy and writing in a particular way, and that they are written by particular kinds of people. And that had implications for what was going to be offered to the field. And then I just sort of drew on a few examples. So this is one way that you can show your reader that you've done the reading, that you know the field, you're familiar with the main debates in the field without having to work methodically through every single piece of writing you've ever read, every single study. Because if you try and do that in literature review, you're most likely A, going to run out of space, and B, the sort of that need to show your reader exactly what you've written often means you're going to derail your argument because you're going to be trying to do too much. So you've got to be selective. But by characterizing things like this up front, you kind of give that nice big overview before you get into the nitty-gritties. Okay, then you will start to see, as we move down, highlighted in green, I always made sure to show what the studies offered. So what were the positives? And then I would use an example from a particular study to illustrate and to give a little bit more insight into what the studies found. And so it sort of touches on a bit of the methods or the scope of the study, what kind of data was used, and also what it was able to show the field. And then I repeated that pattern again, and I did that fairly often. That sort of, what do they show in general terms? Here's an example in a little bit more detail. And you'll see in that second blue block, I also mentioned the theories that get used in existing research. And then to sort of bring it back to the study on hand and to try and bring in that more evaluative, critical stance, I then start pulling out what the limitations are. And then I give a little bit of a nice sort of gesture and show they are useful, but they're limited. but they're useful for this other thing, but they're limited. And each time you draw out those limitations must be feeding into what you're going to be doing. Because essentially you are flagging the limitations. You're saying these studies are really good for doing X, but they can't really do Y. And it's good to actually say they can't do Y because of whatever. They're looking at the wrong data, they don't have the right theoretical lenses, whatever it might be. And then you are going to be positioning your study as being able to do Y. So that's how you start using literature in a more active way to start creating and constructing that gap. As I said, this is like a very explicit example. And it, I'm hoping it's giving you ideas if you can't see a perfect fit for your discipline. But yeah, I did find it helpful for me. Okay, I'm just reading James's comment. Yes, generalizability. It might be that. And perhaps then that instead of how I've done it there, you might have to make an argument and say the literature on this topic is incredibly diverse. And you have some studies doing this and some studies doing that. And that would be kind of the argument and the opening characterization that you would offer your reader. It's really just to sort of stand back from individual studies and try and give your reader a sense of the field. So sometimes, it's not that the studies all sort of gravitate towards one type of study. They might be totally diverse, but then just explain that to your reader and then go into a few examples to really highlight just how diverse your field is. So you'll need to tweak this according to what is being presented in your literature review, in the literature in your field, and in relation to your discipline. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to spend just 4 minutes, and then I want to get some volunteers to share with us, and then we're just going to wrap it up afterwards. So we're almost at the end. But just for you to process some of these ideas that we've been chatting about this afternoon, is I want you to think about your topic area and just write down for yourself as much as you can for 4 minutes. What kind of studies dominate in your topic area? And think about that when I say what kinds of studies. Think about, are they qualitative, quantitative, what kinds of data, what kinds of theories, and those sorts of questions. And then if you have time and you can get to it, start writing about what do they offer and how are they limited. Okay, so we're going to spend the next 4 minutes doing that. And then we will report back and share some ideas. Okay, so I'm going to leave you now for 4 minutes. Off you go. Write as much as you can. Okay, your writing time is over. So do we have maybe 2 volunteers that would like to come in and take the mic and tell us very briefly what kind of studies dominate and let's say where they're limited? Who would like to come in? No one? Are you thinking hard? Okay, well then maybe let me ask another question of you is, and you don't have to answer it now, but something to think about. If you look at what you have written, is that coming through in your literature review at the moment? For those of you who have already started or maybe have a draft, or is that information coming through in your writing about what kinds of studies are there and particularly what they offer? So what do we know about the topic? But then also, where are the limitations? And thinking about that in terms of your gap. So we have someone unmuted, Lucia Dube. Do you want to come in? Lucia? Okay. Crispin.
Hello, Kester, how are you?
Hello, fine, and you?
I literally just came to give you moral support.
I'm okay with the silences. I'm okay. I'm a teacher.
I know the point is that I also, entering into the space where you'll be marking other post thesis and so on. So I thought I need that kind of feedback, or that kind of workshop like this one. So yes, when I did my own writing, the issues that you are raising were quite pertinent, but what I did is I didn't frame them in the ways that you are using, which I think is more technical and professional. What I did was I would look at literature and general trends in the literature, and then I would look at the literature that kind of critique the aspects, the mainstream argument. So for me, it was always a matter of balancing the mainstream argument and those that could be coming in the form of kind of criticism to that particular thing, because obviously the whole world cannot think in the same way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Crispin.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. James, you want to come in?
Thanks, Kirsten, for a brilliant presentation. Sorry for the silence. I was completing the evaluation. But just to answer your questions, what kind of studies dominate in my field? I'm from environmental science. It's mainly mixed methods research. In other words, we use both quantitative and qualitative methods. The main challenge which we have been or which has been highlighted in the past by some of our external examiners is that most of our studies have tended to focus on interviews as a method of answering research questions. But I just wanted to let you know that you have given us a brilliant seminar today. I'll actually give this as homework to all my postgraduate students before I ask them to write a literature review. Thank you very much.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, James. All right, folks, I think we should move on. I've just got 1 or 2 more slides, and then there will be time, hopefully at the end, for 1 or 2 questions. Okay, so something very important to say, this is my second last slide, is that there is, unfortunately, like most academic writing, there is no one size fits all recipe or rule. And different studies are going to always look slightly different. And you will also be creating different kinds of gaps. There's no such thing as one kind of research gap. It's for you to create, and they can look quite different. And here are just some examples. So it could be that nobody has tackled the problem before, so you might be doing something very new. You could be looking at a new context. You could be looking at a new aspect of the problem. You could be offering a different perspective. You could be positioning your research in relation to existing research, in that who you are as a person gives your research credibility that other research perhaps doesn't have, or it offers the field a very particular voice that has otherwise been missing. And we see that quite a lot in sort of cultural studies, or even African studies, where who you are as a person holds sort of currency in that academic space. Your lived experiences, because of who you are, perhaps based on your race, or perhaps based on your gender, or because you lived through a particular event in time, that gives you more legitimacy than other researchers. And that might be the gap that you are contributing to. So they can look very different, and it depends on your study, and it will also be determined in part by your discipline, in terms of what's counted as legitimate and valued knowledge in your discipline. So there's, just a big message and a reminder that there's no recipe, and they will ultimately look different, but that there are, steps that we can use in order to move beyond just the summarizing. All right, so then just very finally, just to recap, among other things, the literature review is where you also are establishing the rationale for doing your research. And that is done by constructing a particular kind of gap in the field. And that gap is what you argue for in your writing. They don't just exist. And so it's actually more than just the summarizing. It's about being active and putting that literature to use for your own means. So it's about showing what is known, and perhaps having some sort of evaluative comment about how it came to be known. So like the methods, the theories, the whatever. About showing and telling your reader what is missing and why it's missing. Why don't we have this knowledge? And then very importantly, why we should even care. And this is where you start positioning your study and telling your reader that this is actually really important, and that they need to listen up and read on. And then just going back to that sort of overall picture of the thesis, just remember that your conclusion is going to speak back to the rationale. So the gap that you construct at the very beginning will ultimately be the knowledge that you are going to contribute by the end, whether it's a master's or a PhD or whatever it is. So just keep in mind sort of that relationship over the course of a thesis. It is quite a long document, but you need to have that logic coming through. So you set up the gap at the beginning, you then walk your reader through how the study was done, you then present the new knowledge, and then at the very end, you reflect on how that knowledge has now contributed to that gap. Okay, and there are some references. As I say, this is the paper, the Cameron and Thompson one, that's a really useful chapter. I use it a lot. So for any supervisors in the room as well, it's quite a cool chapter. But just to say thanks very much for sticking it out for this afternoon and for being here. And I hope it's been useful. And then just to take any questions that anyone might have. We have a few minutes left. If you can bear to sit and concentrate for any longer. If not, I don't blame you. But any questions, you are welcome to pop in the chat. I'm just going to have a look quickly and see where we can find the slides and the recordings. I will liaise with Asipe And we will make sure, because we have all your email addresses from registration for the event, so we will make sure that those get emailed to you. So don't worry about that. Okay, we've got one question there. Do we include a historical background of the literature? So I'm going to give you a very frustrating answer to that, in that these decisions must definitely be made in consultation with your supervisor, because it may depend on your field and what's expected. But what I can say from my perspective is I did sort of I started my literature review with a kind of an overview of the timeline of how research had developed from sort of the 1940s, 1960s, and the different sort of understandings of writing that had emerged over time. And then the bulk of the literature review was sort of current research. So that worked for me. It might not work for you. There are different ways of doing it. But I think, yeah, if you need it, if you feel like you need it to make your argument, then it would be good to have it in.
I just wanted to say something, Kirsty, if you don't mind. For me, I found it very relevant to briefly kind of, you not necessarily give a detailed background of the history of that particular literature, but people may ask the question, why are you studying this? It has been there talked about for quite a long time. But then a brief historical kind of trace gives an idea of the shifts that are happening within that particular field. That's what worked in my own case.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think it's really, if shifts have occurred historically, you don't have to go back into all the details, but I think just to be able to show your reader that that these big shifts have happened, or that there's been a lot of debate in the field, and can give like an overview, I think that will help to convince them that you've read widely and you are familiar. All right, let's see, there's a repeat question. How would you want to approach the lit review when the field is new and there hasn't been much published? That's a great question, and definitely going to be more and more studies, I think, pushing the boundaries in that way. I would say, definitely try and find as much as you can, and then you're going to have to argue and explain to your reader that is perhaps the case, but obviously be sure of it. You don't want to say there's not much literature and actually you've just missed some, but you would explain that through the writing. And then I think to try and draw on a few studies that are as similar as possible, to give the reader a sense of what similar kind of research has done, in order to justify particular aspects of your study. I'm just trying to think of an example now. So say if nobody's really looked at what could we do? This is a silly example because of course there's been lots of research on it, but say nobody had ever thought to interview doctoral students. Okay, so this is what one of my students is doing the study. Actually, he's going to be interviewing doctoral students, former doctoral students who are no longer in their doctoral programs because they've withdrawn or they've deregistered. And there's not much research on that particular topic. And so what he could do then is start looking at, well, what research is there on doctoral candidates more generally? What kind of methods, theories, approaches, perspectives do they use? And then through that sort of make a case for, okay, well, this other thing hasn't really been looked at, but going on the basis of those other studies, it would appear that a qualitative study would be appropriate, and these sorts of theories or perspectives would be useful. So yeah, the parallel studies. Okay, what else is there? You mentioned something about attacking the author, a little more clarity. Okay, so when you go on the attack, you would say, so let's go back here. So instead of saying, so let's go with this last paragraph. While providing useful insights for understanding how writing is experienced, these detailed studies typically foreground contextualized perspectives. I could have said there, detailed interpretive studies are useless because they cannot further our understandings of pedagogy. You know, it's using sort of really sort of critical and at times sort of nasty attacking language where you just dismiss something. So you might come across a study that claims to provide insight on why women behave in a particular way, and you might be able to see that woman there has just been taken for granted that it's a white woman's experience. And so you could come in and say, the study completely misses the point and is not useful at all because it's taken for granted that a woman's experience is a white woman's experience. You know, it's kind of that harsh sort of language whereas you could come in and say, you know, while the study is useful for showing that women's experiences differ from men's experiences, what it fails to account for is that it's made an assumption that all women's experiences are the same. So I hope that clarifies things. It's just about being a little bit more careful with your language. You can be critical, you can challenge, you can dismiss, but there's a sort of a way of doing it that's still respectful. And I think we should try and err on the side of being respectful, but strong in our academic writing. Okay. Any other? Oh, that last comment. It's too hard to say. You can't give a number. It's as many readings and as many references as the argument needs. I'm afraid it's one of those wishy-washy answers. Yeah, it's enough. It's enough reading to convince your reader that you know what you're doing and that you know the field. I'm just reading Sophia's comment. Do we need to mention all the research history? I mean, like we give a summary about what other research has done before and what they found. Yeah, so I think if I'm understanding you correctly, you can refer to a study like I've done in my example. So you can say, you know, for example, in the study, they found X, Y, and Z through their analysis. And, you know, while that's really useful, what the analysis wasn't able to do or what they didn't consider in the study was this other stuff. Or you can refute the results. I mean, if it's more sort of quantitative stuff, you can make the argument that the results are flawed because of a flawed method or whatever. And then you might be positioning your study as offering a better or a more appropriate method. But yeah, I hope that gives some sort of answer there. Okay, yes. So James is asking about whether instead of sort of attacking literature, if something is not a good source or whatever, can't you just leave it alone? And yeah, I think that is a good comment. I mean, if it's if that literature is well cited in the field, you might need to engage with it a bit more. But if it's sort of on the periphery and someone just did something a little bit obscure at some point in time, you can sort of just leave it alone. And that's where it comes back to Kamala and Thompson's argument earlier in the PowerPoint, where they said you've got to be selective. You've got to take what you need. Take what you need in order to do your job, but at the same time, make sure that you are true to the field, that you are giving your reader or your examiner an overall impression of the field. But that's not to say that you have to go into detail about every study that you really don't align with. Okay, everyone, I think we're going to have to call it a day there. But yeah, just once again, thank you so much for being here this afternoon and for listening and for sharing your ideas and asking all these fantastic questions. I really do appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, Asipe.
Thank you, Doc. Thanks to you as well for sharing your knowledge. Goodbye, everyone.